going to be talking about climate change and rare plants. And I want to thank the Illinois Native Plant Society for inviting me to give this talk. So this is just an overview of my talk today. Briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different climate scenarios for Illinois into the future. Also, briefly, I'm going to talk about the flora of Illinois, just to put the work that I'm going to be presenting in context. And then I'm going to talk about this cool project that we did where we assess all the rare plants in terms of their vulnerability to climate change using the CCBI NatureServe tool. Then I will spend some time presenting some evidence for a few plants about how they're going to respond to climate change. Then I'm going to propose some strategies that can be used to mitigate climate change, and then I will end with some conclusions remarks. So in Illinois, we're very lucky that just recently the Nature Conservancy put together this report. And I would like to say that if you were concerned about climate change in Illinois, read this report, because then you're going to become more concerned about it. So I will say read chapter 2. There's a lot of very good information. But in general, what the report is pointing out is that when it comes to temperature in Illinois, if we look at 100 years of data, we are seeing that temperatures in Illinois have been increasing for each of the different seasons. And what has been projected to happen when it comes to temperature is that Illinois is just going to get hotter and hotter. The same thing has been happening with precipitation. For the past 100 years, we have been seeing an increase in the amount of precipitation that Illinois has been getting, and that depending upon the climate, the emission scenario that you use, again, we are going to have different patterns of precipitation, and precipitation is going to increase within some regions in Illinois. So in general, our climate in Illinois is going to look more like Texas during the summer. At the end of the 21st century, there is projections that we can have increases between 4 to 9 degrees or 8 to 14 degrees, depending upon the emission scenario. And that when it comes to precipitation, we are going to have these events that are going to be heavy downpours, but then we are going to have prolonged periods of drought. So this is going to affect our flora. So when it comes to the flora of Illinois, and probably all of you that are attending this talk today are familiar with this, based on the latest Mullenbrock 2014, there are roughly 2,442 native plants here in Illinois. We have more non-native, and based on the Illinois Endangered Species Board, we have 332 plants that are rare, and 80% of them have been listed as endangered. So if you do a quick calculation here, 14% of the flora of Illinois is of conservation concern. There are many reasons for the decline of our species here in Illinois. Some of them have to do, like for example, habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, invasive species. Some other ones have to do more with the biology of the species. Maybe they lost a specific pollinator that they need for reproduction. But today, we're going to be focusing on climate change. So my hope at the end of this talk is that two takeaways. One is that we have a better understanding of how climate change will impact our plants in Illinois, and some of the strategies that we can use to mitigate the impact of climate change when it comes to rare plants. And some of the work that I'm going to be presenting today is coming from this publication, An Assessment of the Vulnerability of Illinois Rare Plants to Climate Change. And I'm very proud of this publication because it was a labor of love. And I believe that Illinois has been the first state that has assessed all the rare plants when it comes to climate change. So I'm very This is what we did. And actually, Jill Beatty, who was the one that did the bulk of this work, we utilized a tool that was developed by NatureServe, the CCBI, the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. And this index ranks the climate change vulnerability of a species based on their exposure and sensitivity to the predicted climate change, using the species biology, species distribution, and ecology information about the biology, ecology, and the distribution of the species. Basically, the tool, the framework is that you set up when you want to evaluate the type of climate change that is going to happen. Then you assess or you gather information about how sensitive the species is going to be to that predicted climate change. You document all of that. The tool generates an index, and based on that index, you can make conservation management efforts or decisions or put into forward practices. So at the end, I mentioned that it generates an index. So it assigns one of this score. Either the species is going to be extremely vulnerable, meaning that most likely it's not going to make it during those climate projections, or it might be just fine. So our approach was a basic one. We followed the instructions. We generated present absence maps for more than 300 species. We selected the mid-century climate projection to generate the data for temperature and precipitation based on the A1B emission scenario. Then we approached experts. And minimum, we had 2 experts per species. Some of them we have close to 10. And show them how to populate the CCBI tool. This is kind of like the front end of the tool. We provided the information about temperature and precipitation for section A. And then for section B and C, we asked them, what do you think based on this temperature and precipitation? What is the sensitivity of this particular species to climate change? How vulnerable do you believe they're going to be? And then again, an index was generated. This project took about 1 year. And at the end, you can summarize the entire work with this figure, that 88% of Illinois herb plants are going to be vulnerable to climate change. And this is a big number, but in reality, what you're seeing here is the following, that 47% of our species are going to be moderately vulnerable to climate change. During that, it has been projected that by the mid-century, you're going to see that some of the populations might decline a little bit, the individuals within those populations. We have another portion, 35%, that are going to be highly vulnerable to climate change, again, meaning that we will see more decline of those populations. But then you have some individuals, some species, like 12% of the rare plants that we assess, that they seem to be that they're going to be fine. But then you have the 6% that are going to be extremely vulnerable to climate change. We have predicted that. So just to give you an example of some of the species, and I'm going to focus just on the federal species that we have because we spend a lot of money on them. We were able to determine that Cirsium pitchera, Delia foliosa, Platanthera leucophila, and the lakeside daisy are going to be extremely vulnerable to climate change. In the case of highly vulnerable species, we have the prairie bush clover. And then for moderately vulnerable species, we have Asclepia media. Then we have Boltonia decurrens that it looks like, based on the index, is supposed to kind of like do okay. And there are many reasons for why the species are going to be vulnerable to climate change based on the assessment by the experts. We found out that 97% of the species, the primary reason is because of habitat fragmentation, habitat loss. But also we were able to discover that for 88% of the species, the dispersal capability was going to be affected. Is going to make them more vulnerable to climate change. Then we have close to 60% that we believe that there's going to be a disruption in some kind of interaction, plant-pollinator interactions that is going to make them more vulnerable to climate change. And then you may have some of these other physiological aspects associated with the plant that potentially will make them less capable to be good competitors or to grow. So there are many reasons why the species are going to be vulnerable. So what evidence for vulnerability to predicted climate change do we have for our Illinois rare plants? Well, a lot of that evidence is coming from a very limited number of species, mostly federally listed species, because those are the species that we put a lot of money into. Also, a lot of these federally listed species have very long-term demographic data sets here in Illinois. So those very long-term demographic data sets allow us to have a better understanding in terms of which life history trait or stage could be affected by climate change. And then we have multiple examples of reintroduction of some of these listed species where we can, again, have a better understanding, depending upon where they're introduced, how potentially climate change could affect them. And then we have tons of different models these days that allow us to utilize precipitation, temperature to predict future climate condition, and then we can combine those models with the demographic data that we have. To give you an idea of potentially what's going to happen to Delia foliosa, the leafy prairie clover, we were very lucky to have a long-term data set of roughly 11 years where we collected demographic data, number of seedlings, number of adult blooming, non-blooming. We gather temperature precipitation data to see what was creating the variation among years for these different demographic stages. And then we were lucky enough to have 16 different climate models that we could use to predict how the population that we were studying was going to change based on those models. And pretty much what we found was that regardless of the mission scenario, the model that we were using, the population of leafy prairie clover that we were studying was going to decline. Another example that I can provide is with Cirsium pitcheri, where Patty Vitt and her group, they use species distribution models to see where the suitable habitat for this species was going to be due to future conditions. And the top panel shows the suitable habitat right now. You can see that in Illinois, we have suitable habitat, but in the future, all that habitat is going to shift to the north. And another example with Cirsium pitcheri was this cool project that was done where they study how seedlings from populations that were outside Illinois, how they were going to respond to future temperatures found in Illinois. And what they found out was that by the end of the 21st century, temperature is going to be so hot that these seedlings are not going to do well, and most likely they're going to be dying. So the establishment of populations via seedlings is put into question for this particular species. And we can do the same thing for these other threatened rare plants here in Illinois, because we have those long-term data sets. So we can investigate, is it temperature, is it precipitation that is going to be the key factor in the future that is going to affect this species. So we know something about how climate change will impact rare plants in Illinois. So let's talk about some of the strategies to mitigate climate change for these Illinois rare plants. So one thing that I want you to remember is that we have tons of species that are of conservation concern. We have many populations for those species, or we may have a single population for that particular species. However, species do not care about boundaries. So whatever we do here in Illinois, we need to think about the entire range of that species, and then be mindful that we have to collaborate with state agencies from other states to make this happen and being successful. Another thing that we need to take into account and we need to start talking about is the reality that some species are going to make it, some species are not. So I would like to hear your thoughts about this. We're going to have winners, we're going to have losers, and how we deal with this particular topic. So in terms of the strategies, we can talk about habitat strategies to mitigate climate change. We know that we're protecting land here in Illinois. We have state, federal, NGOs, private citizens that are protecting land, but I will argue that we need to keep protecting even more land. Even land that seems to be marginal, we can always restore that land. Another thing that we need to do is increase connectivity among land, the protected land. If you remember habitat fragmentation, dispersibility was one thing that was affecting this species. So we need to increase the connectivity among these habitats. We need to continue doing habitat management. When we talk about climate change, we have to talk about the climate is going to be affecting the habitat where the species are found. And we need to keep conducting monitoring, because we may find out that new species are coming into Illinois that potentially can exclude our native flora. At the species level, I will argue that we need to keep gathering basic biology for all of our species. For many of the species, we just know that they're there, but we don't know much about the biology. We need to collect seeds, bank seeds, and keep maintaining the genetic diversity for all the different populations that we have and the species that we have. I will argue too that if we have a better understanding of how species are going to be changing their range, that will help with any project that we can do to mitigate climate change. And then we have to talk about the subject of assisted migration, which I would like to hear your opinion during the discussion. Do you believe that we should be doing or that or not? So yes, I mean, we have a lot of challenges. Over 88% of our species, rare species, are going to be vulnerable to climate change. We have just a little bit of very good data for a few of them. But at the same time, I'm very hopeful and optimistic that we can keep improving what we're doing to do something about climate change and rare plants. For example, I'm looking forward to the work that is going on with Lissy, Macchia, Borealis, that the CCBI Tool has proposed that is highly vulnerable. This is work that Emily, the current president of the Illinois Native Plant Society, is doing. So I would like to know more about how this project is going and what they're finding. Also, I want to thank the Illinois Native Plant Society for providing funding to do research. This is huge, and I appreciate, as a researcher, having an organization that gives funding for rare plant. This year, they provided funding for a grad student that is going to be looking at climate change, habitat suitability models, and rare plants. And also they fund projects to check EORs for all of our rare plants. So this year, for example, Susan McIntyre is looking for Polygala incarnata. And this is helping us understand the current distribution of the species in Illinois. So that, I would like to again thank the Illinois Native Plant Society for inviting me to give this talk. I would like to thank all the experts that help us with the CCBI, in particular Rick Philippi and John Evinger, and then my co-authors Jill Bailey, David Saya, and Greg Spirea, and then Paul Markham for some of the photos that I used during this presentation.